Dr. Wilson Adero, and I want us to study something on descriptive statistics. That is a topic and a research method. Now, basically what we're trying to come up with is that research and innovations are essential in any part of life, and I think up to now, you've actually come across different areas in research, and you find out that it's actually life. Research is life, and life is research, because we need research to come up with new things. And what we're trying to say is that in research, we normally have what we call data. A lot of data is being is collected, and for this case, we need ways that we can be able to probably work on this data. And for that reason, the statistics, which is a branch of mathematics, come into play. And this basically entails the collection, organization, and analysis of data, more so numerical data. And it normally looks at what we call the experimental designs, if you can recall what we talk about, more so in the field of quantitative research. So statistics is divided into two major divisions. We have what we call the descriptive, and we also have the inferential statistics. Today, I want us to just focus on the descriptive statistics. That is from the word to describe descriptive statistics. But maybe before we begin, we could ask ourselves, what are some of the importances, or why is it important to study or to engage statistics in research? So descriptive statistics basically, generally it aims to describe, to summarize, and to explain or make sense of a given set of data. And the following, I'm just going to state a few, are why are actually the importance, or why it's important to have statistics in research. Number one is because statistics permits the exact kind of description of a particular attribute, where you don't have to use estimate by saying John is a bit tall, Peter is a bit short, but we can say Peter is 20 meters, John is 5 meters, and such like things. We don't really need to look at estimate, but talk about the exact. They also force us to be definite and exact in this description of our thinking. And they also enable us to summarize, because, you know, when you talk about data in a given research area, we are actually looking at a wide array of data, and we need a way of coming up with specifics where we can use. Like, for example, I want you to think of a class where you're taking the scores of learners who are numerous in number. Basically what happens is you may need to describe the general performance of the class, and you cannot speak about the score of each and every learner. So for that case, you'll be required to say that the class had a mean of, let's say, 50 or even 60% in a given area. And that, amongst other reasons, we talk about the prediction of values that are importance of statistics. We also talk about conclusions and stuff. All these are what we call the general importance of statistics. Now, statistics also has its own rules or its own symbols. And generally, we find that in most cases, there are what we call summaries. There are summaries which are used to represent particular functions. And this include symbols like X, which are used to represent raw scores. Of course, I'm going to present this material for you much later to be able to analyze much better. We also have what we call the summation symbols. We have the I, which present the interval or the class intervals in a given distribution. All these are very important when you talk about statistics. And it's good to note that some symbols which may be used or may have meanings in English or other areas of studies have specific meaning when you talk about statistics, and that's why it's important for you to pass through the handout and ensure that you're able to familiarize yourself, so that when you meet the symbols and fail to see the actually attached meaning, you are able to understand and basically interpret what they mean at that particular time. Now, organization of data. The word data basically is the plural of datum. So one is datum. When it's quite a number, they are called data. So it means, data means the evidence or facts describing a group or situation. Example of data is height, score, weight, and so forth and so on. And we're saying that for understanding the meaning and deriving the useful conclusion of data, you have to organize or arrange it in a systematic way. And the organization of data basically entails the arrangement in a way that allows for interpretation. And there are several ways that you can actually organize your data. Number one, we have what we call the statistical tables, we have what we call the rank order, and we also have what we call the frequency distribution. Now, just to mention some aspects which are important in these data organization formats. Number one is the statistical table I've just talked about. Basically, a statistical table enables you to arrange data in some properly selected classes, and the arrangement is described by titles and subtitles. And I think most of you have come across tables where you have titles, you have subtitles, which are quite important when you're trying to arrange your data in one way or another. Now, there are several considerations that a researcher is supposed to consider when they are arranging this data. And number one is that the title should be simple, concise, and unambiguous. This actually allows for easier understanding. Because you see, when you put so much story in the title, then the person who's trying to look at your work or your tables may not understand very well what it all entails. So there should be simplicity in stating the title. We also talk about the data should be divided into columns and rows according to the nature and the purpose of data. And this actually allows you to avoid mixing. For example, if you have the performance of a class and you want to work out some kind of gender-based performance, knowing maybe how the male students and the female performed, then you can have within the same table different columns. It's also good to note that the heading of each column or row should be as brief as possible. In fact, when you talk about the title, it's brief, but more brief should be the headings of this particular column. And at times, it's possible to find a situation where you have more than 2 rows of column handling a similar kind of information. And for this case, we are saying that you can just have a common, maybe like gender, and then talk about the sub areas of male and female, instead of having gender for male and another gender for female. That actually comes up with a lot of repetition, which may not be necessary. We also have other areas which are important to consider when you are actually constructing a statistical table, and these include the subtotals. We also have the units of data. These are it's very important to mention. People can know whether you're using centimeters, meters, weight, newtons, kilograms. It's very important to state this. And also, you can have footnotes which are, when it is necessary, to explain maybe information that may appear in your table and may be ambiguous in nature. This allows for easier interpretation of the information contained in your table. So, also provide the source of data. And this is because, you know, as a researcher now, you're going to be required to consider the work of previous researchers or former researchers, and also to take care of issues of plagiarism. So it's very important that when you get a table, you identify the source, or you acknowledge the source of that particular data. And all in all, we're saying that the table should be simple and easy to interpret. Now, the next table I've talked about as a way of organizing data is the rank order. And we've come across the term rank in several of our discussion, if you can recall. And basically, rank entails grouping of data in either ascending or descending order, or we talk about in order of merit. So for this purpose, we're going to just maybe speak about a descending series, where we're going to begin with what we call the highest values and finish up with the lowest values. And if you consider a psychological test where you have around 50 probably scores that have been obtained from the test, this can be arranged in a manner where you can easily obtain the highest and the least value. And you find that now this turns out to be information and not just a set of data anymore, because you can be able to derive some meaning based on that particular arrangement, instead of when you have all the values but you are not able to really fathom what they're all about. So Rank order, simple way of arranging data, but quite efficient in informing a researcher on the way forward when they are doing their research. We also talk about another form, and this is the frequency distribution table. What should you know about the frequency distribution? One way that data can be viewed in a very efficient manner is what we call through the frequency distribution. This basically entails the arrangement of data in forms of frequency, which sometimes may be percentage, or frequency basically mean that the order of occurrence. How much does the datum occur? So this form of organization of data can actually be done either actually in groups or on an individual basis. And usually we find that data is normally distributed or sometimes repeated in a given set of collection. And for us to be able to understand it better, we may be required to group it and then be able to come up with ways of trying to interpret or understand it much better. In the construction of frequency distribution, there are several very important steps that as a researcher you are supposed to know. Number one is you should be able to find the range, and that's the first step. And the range, a simple term which I think most of us have learned from our elementary levels of study. The range basically entails that you should be able to get the difference between the highest value and the least value. So the data which I had given, you find that the range is a value that falls between 9 and 22, which basically is 47. Step number 2, you should be able to determine the class intervals, or what we call the grouping interval. And this can be done using the following rules. Number 1, you can obtain the class interval, which is denoted generally by I, and the range is normally divided by the number of classes desired. So as a rule, if the series has fewer than 50, the number of classes should not exceed 10. And if the series has between 50 and 100, you should have between 10 and 15 classes. And of course, if the series has more than 100, then it's not normally good to exceed 15. Around 15 or around their number of classes is quite okay. The rule number 2 is that the class interval is normally decided first, and then the number of classes are determined much later. So in the above case I've just talked about, rule number 1, the range is 47, as I had initially indicated, and since the number of cases in our series are around 50, 10 classes are actually sufficient. And for that case, the class interval will be around 47 divided by 10, which is 4.7, into the nearest whole number that should give you 5. Step number 3 in the construction of a frequency distribution table. And remember, I'm saying that frequency distribution table basically entail a table where values are arranged based on their frequency. And I've said you can have a distribution table where you have individual values and you get the number of times they appear, or you can even have grouped values, individuals being values being arranged in a given groupings. And I'm talking about the groups for this case. I've talked about the 2 steps. Step number 3 is you should write the content of the frequency distribution. And this, you should be able to draw the 3 columns where you have the classes of the distribution, of course. In this case, you have the lowest class is decided, and then the rest of the class are divided as you go up. And for our case, the data which I am actually presenting to you, the least class will be 2024. And after that, you have the tallies. Basically, the tallies helps when one is trying to find out the number of times particular values are actually appearing. Because you see, when you just count them and you don't tally, there's a high likelihood that you will ignore some of these values, and you end up coming up with probably a frequency distribution that is not accurate. So tallies are important, but of course when we progress, researchers normally don't like to apply them because they look quite elementary, which of course is not a bad thing, but as you're beginning, of course they are quite important, and also when you're teaching basic research, they are quite important. Finally, you come up with the frequencies, and this basically are just the number of tallies which are obtained in each particular grouping. Now, the illustration which I'll also give is an example of a frequency distribution table, and you can see the columns are well indicated. We have the tallies and we also have the frequencies. Of course, this gives you the picture that is required. Now, just to move a bit further, we also have what we call the cumulative frequency and cumulative percentage frequency. These are derived from the frequency distribution table. But we should note, the frequency distribution tables will normally tell you in a way which frequency are distributed over the various class intervals, but they do not tell you the total number of cases or the percentage of cases lying above or below that class interval. And for you to be able to know the percentage lying above or below, then you can perform the task using what we call the cumulative frequency or the cumulative percentage frequency distribution table, which have also indicated, of course, you can see the table 3.2 have indicated that for you, for your own understanding. You can be able to pass through. And this is important because I want you to take this situation. You have a class, you're given an exam, and the performance actually has been obtained from this class. And now you're asking yourself, maybe a student got 78%. Did this student perform better? Or did you perform even below the mean? You know, there's a chance that you get 78% and you are below the mean because the student performed quite well. And the cumulative frequency distribution table can easily actually tell you some of these facts. And that actually talks about its importance. Now, graphic representation of data. What I've just spoken about is the tabular representation of data using statistical tables. We also have graphical representation of data. And for this case, we are talking about use of graphic or pictorial kind of representations of data, where you have data being given in terms of bar graphs and such kind of things. And maybe before we look at this pictorial representation, we can ask ourselves, why is it important, or what are some of the advantages of presenting our data using pictures? Number one is because pictures are quite appealing to the eye. And I think the old adage, we always have a saying, which says that a picture speaks 1,000 words. Where words may not be able to speak, pictures are normally able to say a lot. And for that case, it's quite important to present our work using pictures. They also provide lasting effect in the brain. We're saying that what you see, you can remember for quite a longer time as compared to what you've actually heard and or probably what you've read. They are also good for comparative analysis. Of course, you can easily compare two graphs. They also help in forecasting the trends. That's among some of the advantages. They help in forecasting the trends. Of course, if you have a graph and you see it moving up, then probably you can easily tell that maybe in the coming season we'll still have some kind of ascension as per the graph format. We also have another important is that they help in proper estimation, evaluation, interpretation. You can easily do estimation based on pictorial presentations. Now, examples of some of these pictorial representation. And number one is what we call the bar graph. The bar graph basically uses bars to represent data. And the height of the bars are normally used to represent the frequencies for the categories that sit on the x-axis. While by tradition, we know that x-axis is normally the horizontal axis, while y-axis is the vertical axis. And it's good to note that bar graphs are generally used to present categorical variables which are not continuous. So if you remember, we said initially that categorical variables are aspects like the sex or the gender, male, female. You are either in one or the other. That's categorical. A class, you can either be in Form 1, Form 2, or you can either be doing this course A or course B, or University A or University B. You cannot be in both as a student. Basically, categorical just indicates that you are either in one category or the other. That is the kind of data that is normally represented using a bar graph. We also have another example, which is the histogram, and this shows the frequency and shape that characterize a quantitative variable. So in statistics, we often want to see the shape of the distribution of a quantitative variable. And having your computer program provides you with a histogram is actually a simple way of doing this. The pictorial representation, how does data move? How is the shape of data? And you know, for this case, we normally have continuous data, unlike a bar graph. We also have the line graph, and this uses sometimes more than one line to depict information. And basically, when you talk about line graph, then the idea of what we are saying, the comparison aspect of graphical representation comes up. You can have a graph which represents a flow of data over several number of years. So when this is done, then you're able to see the trend. And apart from the trend, you are also able to perform a comparison amongst this data. We also have what we call the scatter plots. And scatter plots are normally used when you want to depict relationships between quantitative variables. Yeah, like we talk about the correlation. If you have two particular variables, X and Y, and they are related in a particular way, you want to indicate the correlation, then you can have a scatter plot. And maybe to just refresh your mind, if you can remember in our elementary days, back maybe in secondary, primary, before you drew a graph, you had to make plots or points where the lines were supposed to pass through, so that you actually drew the line of best fit, which cuts across most of the points. So a scattergram looks almost the same, only that for this case, we normally don't consider the drawing of the line of best fit, but we just look at the pattern of distribution of this plot, or the scatter. How have they been scattered along the X and the Y axis? Now, that's something about graphical representation. Now, I want us to also look at another very important aspect in statistics, and that is the measure of central tendency. Measure of central tendency. Now, the measure of central tendency provides descriptive information about the single numerical value that is considered to be the most typical of the other quantitative value. So by this, what I mean is this. When we say that a certain value is an aspect of the measure, or is a measure of central tendency, what we mean is that that value represents the typical characteristics of a given set of values. And maybe just to mention some of these measures, we have what we call the mean, the mode, and the median. Those are measures of central tendency. So these three measures, when we talk about the mean, for example, which is also known as the average, when we say that the average performance of these students was a plane, what we are basically trying to bring forth is that the B-plane is the picture of the performance of this group of students. Actually, it represents, and I think for us as parents, when you're trying to look for schools for our children, we don't ask for individual performance, but we ask for general performance of that school. And we assume that the general performance is actually what all the students obtain, unlike it being the actual thing, but that is the general assumption. Now, we also talk about the mode. Apart from the mean, you also have the mode, and the mode basically represents the most occurring value in a particular distribution, or the most frequently occurring number. And apart from mode, we also have the median, and the median is the center of a given set of number, the center point of a set of numbers, and it's also called the 50th percentile. Of course, there are several rules when you are calculating the central, maybe you're calculating the values of the central tendency, and maybe if I begin with the median. When you calculate the median, it's important to first of all place your values in either ascending or descending order, and then move forth and apply the following rule. Number one is that if you have odd number of values, then the median is normally the center. That is, if you have 5 numbers, then the median will be the third number. But if you have even number of values, then the average of the two innermost, or the two central numbers, actually gives you the median of that particular data. So these are just some of the simple rules that we are going to engage in when you're trying to calculate some of these values. Now, apart from the measures of central tendency, we also have another statistical aspect of what we call the measures of variability. Measures of variability. What do these tell us? They tell us how spread or how much variability is present in a given set of data. Now, what we're saying is that it is not enough to know the typical characteristic of a particular set of numbers, but we also need to know how spread are the other values. And I want to give you a simple example. You can have a set of data where you have maybe the mean of these two sets of data is 60%. But one set of data, individuals have performed such that you have people getting 59, 63, 70. Nobody gets above 70 and nobody gets below 50. But the mean is around 60. Another case, you can have a set of data where you still have a mean of 60. But in this case, some people are getting as low as 0.5 or even 0.2%, while some people are getting as high as 99 or even 100%. Now, you can see, as much as these two sets of data have similar mean values, the distribution is very different. And measures of variability actually move forward to tell us more about such kind of information. How spread is the data? That is what these measures actually tell us. How spread is the data? Because we not only need to know about the data, but also how they spread. And we have several measures or several measures of what we call measures of variability. The first one is the range, a very simple measure, and the range basically is the difference between the highest and the least value in a given distribution. That's the range. We also have the variance and standard deviation. Of course, the two are commonly used together because the variance is the square of the standard deviation. And we say that higher values of standard deviation basically indicates that the data really varies a lot. So if you have a set of data and you have a standard deviation which is quite high, that tells you that in that particular distribution, there is a high variation. The students are getting high, low marks. And basically, I would say that variance is just the squared value of the standard deviation. So that should tell you something. And as we move towards the end, we also have what we call the measures of relative standing. Measures of relative standing. And what are these? These are measures which are used to provide information about a particular score or about where a particular score falls in relation to other scores in a given distribution. And we're saying for this case, apart from knowing the values, apart from knowing the mean, that is the characteristic value of a particular set of data, apart from knowing the distribution, that is the variability, how far the values are distributed, we also need to know where particular values are placed in relation to other values in a given score. And this is what I mean. If you have two sets of performances, you can have one set of performance, maybe an exam is given out of 100. And in one set of performance, the students the student who has obtained 60% is actually the first student. Well, in another set, the student who has obtained 60% is almost the last student. So we're saying that In those two sets of data, the performance or the value given may not necessarily inform a researcher about the performance in relation to other students. But when you know that this 60% is actually below the mean, or this 60% is the best student, you are able to make decisions actually based on that kind of knowledge. And we have several measures of this nature. For example, we have what we call the Z-score. A Z-score is one of the examples of the measures of relative standing. The Z-score basically, this is a score which has a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1. So basically, when you have a set of scores, you can convert these scores to Z-scores. You can standardize the scores to Z-scores by taking the scores, subtracting the mean of the scores, and then dividing by the standard deviation. That will give you the Z-score. And by that, it will now enable you to be able to find out what exactly or where exactly does this particular score lie in relation to other scores in a given distribution. So that is the measure of relative standing, which is also a very, very important aspect. And we also have what we call the percentile rank. The percentile rank also is another form of measure of relative standing. And basically, I think I talked about this much earlier. The percentile rank just tells you the percentage that is below a particular score. It tells you the percentage of people who are below a particular score. Now, as I wind up, I want us to look at maybe the relationship amongst variables. So we're saying that it's very important when you have variables in a given study, you find out the relationship amongst these variables. And for one to be able to study the relationship, we normally have different representations. We have what we call the contingency tables, and we also have the correlational and regression analysis kind of calculations, which can help us. And I'll just mention, because we're going to talk about this one much later as we progress. For contingency tables, these are normally used when you have categorical data. And basically, they are used for displaying information in cells, where you can have you can have intersections, and actually you can come up with rules on how maybe two particular sets of values are actually related to each other. So we're going to speak about that. It's good to note in brief, but we're going to speak more when you get to data analysis, more so in the inferential statistics level. Now, regression analysis is another way of looking at relationships, and in this case, the regression analysis basically is an analysis that aims to explain or predict values of a quantitative dependent variable based on one or more quantitative independent variables. So we're saying that you can have what we call the multiple regression, or you can have what we call the linear or the simple regression. All these are supposed to help in the prediction process of a particular quantifiable values. So basically, that is something about descriptive statistics. We have moved a bit further, but that should give you an information that when you have data, it's not enough to have data, but it's quite important to be able to describe this data. And the description of the data can be done in several ways. You can find the typical aspect of that particular the typical aspect of that particular data. You can also find how much the data is spread, and finally you can also find the position of particular data in comparison to the other set of values. So that actually should give you a good foundation, and maybe when you move now to inferential statistics, you'll now be able to note something about what we call the descriptive, which is normally the initial place. So I hope you learn more about that even as you continue increasing your knowledge of the same. So thank you, and that will actually mark the end of our session for this particular time.